Here's something that might genuinely surprise you. For the first 124 years of its existence, the United States of America did not have a permanent income tax. No payroll deductions disappearing before you even see your paycheck. No April 15th deadline circled in red on the calendar. No IRS quietly tracking every dollar you earn. And yet, somehow roads were built. Wars were fought and won. A standing military was maintained on both land and sea. Entire territories were purchased outright, sometimes for pennies on the acre. And an enormous, sprawling continental empire was stitched together, piece by piece, from the rocky shores of the Atlantic all the way to the sun-drenched coast of the Pacific. So the question isn't just some dusty historical curiosity. It's actually kind of urgent, especially if you've ever looked at your own paycheck and wondered where exactly a third of it disappeared to. How did the most powerful nation on earth manage to finance itself for over a century without ever once taking a direct cut of your personal earnings? And maybe more importantly than that, what changed in the year 1913 that fundamentally rewired, permanently and irreversibly, the entire relationship between the ordinary American citizen and their own federal government? The answers to those questions take us on a long and winding journey. A journey through whiskey rebellions fought with muskets and pitchforks. Through brutal tariff wars waged in the halls of Congress. Through land grabs that reshaped the map of a continent. Through backroom political deals struck in smoke-filled rooms. And through the raw, simmering tension between a government that desperately, chronically needed money to survive, and a population that was deeply, almost pathologically allergic to the idea of being taxed directly. Because here's the thing that most people simply don't realize. The Founding Fathers didn't stumble into avoiding income taxes by some happy accident. They built, quite deliberately, an entire constitutional architecture specifically engineered to make a direct tax on personal income almost impossible to implement. And the story of how that carefully constructed architecture was slowly dismantled, piece by piece, brick by brick, over more than a century of conflict, economic upheaval, and relentless political maneuvering. Well, that story turns out to be one of the single most revealing chapters in all of American history. A chapter that explains, in ways most people never stop to consider, why the government we live under today looks almost nothing like the modest, limited institution the founders originally designed on paper in Philadelphia. So let me take you back to the very beginning. Back to a moment when America was flat broke, drowning in crushing debt, and scrambling desperately to figure out how to keep the lights on without the entire fragile experiment tearing itself apart at the seams. When the American Revolution finally ended in 1783, the newly independent United States was not exactly in a mood to throw a party. The war had been won, yes, against tremendous odds. But the financial cost of that victory had been absolutely staggering. The federal government, operating under the loose framework of the Articles of Confederation, had accumulated roughly $54 million in debt. The individual states, not to be outdone, had piled on another $25 million of their own. And here was the fundamental problem baked into the entire system. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government possessed no independent power whatsoever to levy taxes. None. Zero. It could politely request money from the states, which sounds reasonable enough until you realize that the states routinely, almost gleefully, ignored those requests entirely. The central government was essentially reduced to the role of a beggar standing outside its own house, hat in hand. And by the mid-1780s, the country's finances had spiraled into complete and total disarray. This financial crisis, this slow-motion collapse, was one of the primary driving forces behind the Constitutional Convention that convened in Philadelphia in 1787. The men who gathered in that stifling summer heat understood, with painful clarity, that a government without the power to fund itself was really no government at all. It was a fiction. And so, when they sat down to draft an entirely new constitution, they explicitly granted Congress the authority to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. But here's the critical detail that most people, even history buffs, tend to overlook entirely. The founders were deeply, viscerally suspicious of direct taxation, meaning any tax levied straight onto individuals or their personal property. They had, after all, just finished fighting a bloody revolution against a king who taxed them without giving them any say in the matter. The absolute last thing they wanted was to accidentally create a brand new government wielding unchecked power to reach directly into people's pockets whenever it felt like it. So they built in a safeguard, a deliberate speed bump. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution stated plainly that no capitation or other direct tax could be laid unless it was apportioned among the states according to their population. Now, on the surface this might sound like some minor bureaucratic technicality, but it was actually a nearly impossible hurdle to clear. Apportionment meant that if the federal government wanted to raise, say, $10 million through a direct tax, it couldn't simply charge every citizen in the country the same flat rate. Instead, it would have to divide that $10 million among the states based purely on how many people lived in each one. A state holding 10% of the national population would owe exactly $1 million, regardless of whether its citizens happened to be wealthy landowners or dirt-poor farmers scraping by. This made direct taxation absurdly impractical and deeply unfair in practice. A struggling farmer in Georgia could end up paying a far higher effective tax rate than a wealthy merchant in New York, simply because of how the population-to-wealth ratios happened to shake out between their two states. The founders knew exactly what they were doing when they wrote it this way. They were deliberately making direct taxation so cumbersome, so mathematically absurd, that the government would almost never dare to resort to it. And for the most part, that's precisely how things played out for well over a century. For the next 124 years, the federal government funded itself through a completely different set of mechanisms. Mechanisms that seem almost alien to us today, living as we do in an age of automatic payroll deductions and quarterly estimated payments. The first and by far the most important of these mechanisms was the tariff. When George Washington took office in 1789, the very first major piece of legislation he signed into law was the Tariff Act of 1789, also known as the Hamilton Tariff, named after the brilliant and ambitious Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, who championed it tirelessly. The concept behind it was beautifully, elegantly simple. Every single time a foreign good crossed into an American port, whether it was fine British textiles, French wine, Caribbean sugar, or Chinese tea, the importer would pay a duty on it directly to the federal government. These duties were collected at a relatively small number of harbors scattered along the eastern seaboard, which made enforcement remarkably straightforward. You didn't need to build some massive, sprawling bureaucracy to make the whole system work. You just needed a handful of customs collectors stationed right there at the docks, checking manifests and collecting fees. And for a young, overwhelmingly agricultural nation that imported a huge proportion of its manufactured goods straight from Europe, tariffs turned out to be extraordinarily effective at generating steady revenue. From 1790 all the way through 1860, tariffs accounted for roughly 90% of all federal revenue, according to economic historian Douglas Irwin of Dartmouth College. In some particularly strong years, that figure climbed as high as 95%. The tariff was, quite literally, the engine that kept the entire federal machine running smoothly. It paid for the Army. It paid for the Navy. It serviced the ever-present national debt. And it accomplished all of this without the government ever once having to knock on a single citizen's front door and demand a percentage of their hard-earned wages. But Hamilton never saw tariffs as merely a revenue collection tool. He was thinking several moves ahead like the financial chess player he genuinely was. In his landmark 1791 report on manufactures, Hamilton argued that tariffs could serve a dual purpose simultaneously. Yes, they would fill the Treasury's coffers reliably. But they could also, at the very same time, protect America's fledgling, fragile industrial sector from being utterly crushed by the far more advanced and established manufacturing economies of Britain and continental Europe. By making imported goods more expensive at the border, tariffs would naturally encourage Americans to buy domestically produced alternatives instead, which would in turn nurture and grow homegrown industry from the ground up. It was, in essence, protectionism dressed up in the respectable clothing of fiscal policy. And it worked spectacularly well. By the year 1800, federal revenues had nearly tripled, climbing from a mere $3.7 million back in 1792 to $10.8 million, with roughly 90% of that entire sum still coming from tariffs alone. The United States suddenly found itself holding the best credit rating anywhere in Europe, with its government bonds actually selling above par value. For a nation that had been effectively bankrupt just a single decade earlier, this represented an absolutely astonishing turnaround. Now Hamilton understood, with characteristic foresight, that relying exclusively on tariffs carried inherent risk. International trade was volatile by nature. Wars, economic recessions, and diplomatic disputes could all disrupt the steady flow of imports, and with them the steady flow of revenue the government depended on. So he also pushed hard for an additional source of income, something that would supplement the tariffs and provide a financial buffer during leaner times. And that's precisely where the trouble began, because the supplementary revenue source Hamilton had in mind was an excise tax. Specifically, a tax on domestically distilled spirits. Whiskey. In January of 1791, Hamilton proposed what seemed, on the surface at least, like a perfectly reasonable and modest measure. A small tax on whiskey produced within the United States, with the proceeds earmarked to help pay down the crushing national debt, including the various state debts the federal government had recently agreed to assume. Congress passed the measure without much fuss, and President Washington signed it into law. But Hamilton had badly miscalculated the reaction it would provoke on the ground. On the western frontier of Pennsylvania, whiskey was not some optional luxury item. It was an absolute economic lifeline. Farmers living west of the Appalachian Mountains grew corn, rye, and grain in truly staggering abundance. But shipping raw, bulky crops eastward over brutal, barely passable mountain roads was prohibitively expensive and often simply impossible. So instead, they distilled their surplus grain into whiskey, which was lighter, far more durable, and infinitely easier to transport across long distances. In many frontier communities scattered across the backcountry, whiskey literally functioned as currency. People paid off their debts in barrels of whiskey. They traded whiskey directly for tools, supplies, and services. And now, suddenly, the federal government, sitting comfortably in Philadelphia hundreds of miles away from the actual hardship of frontier life, was demanding a tax on every single gallon produced. The backlash was immediate and it was vicious. Tax collectors foolish enough to venture into western Pennsylvania were met with threats, savage beatings, and worse. One particularly unfortunate revenue officer, a man named Robert Johnson, was stripped completely naked, coated in tar, covered in feathers, and left tied to a tree deep in the forest as a warning to others. Other collectors had their homes and barns deliberately burned to the ground. Those who dared to cooperate with federal officials faced anonymous, menacing threats signed by a mysterious figure known only as Tom the Tinker. The message being sent could not have been clearer. Pay the whiskey tax and your barn might just burn down some quiet night. By the summer of 1794, the situation had escalated dramatically into a full-blown armed insurrection. Nearly 400 armed men surrounded the home of John Neville, the regional tax inspector, and shots were exchanged in a violent confrontation. One member of the local militia was killed in the fighting. Within just a few weeks, some 7,000 frontier rebels had gathered near Pittsburgh, openly threatening to seize the federal armory by force, and some among them were even whispering about declaring outright independence from the United States entirely. Rumors reached all the way back to Philadelphia that certain rebel leaders were quietly negotiating with the British and the Spanish, hoping to secure recognition as an independent, sovereign territory. President Washington saw this uprising as nothing less than an existential threat to the survival of the young republic itself. If a determined minority could dictate terms to the majority through raw force, he declared, then the entire experiment of Republican government was finished before it had really begun. He responded decisively, nationalizing nearly 13,000 militia troops drawn from 4 surrounding states, and personally rode west at the head of the column himself, making him the only sitting president in American history to ever take the field as an active commander-in-chief. When the assembled army finally arrived near Pittsburgh, the rebellion simply collapsed without a single major battle being fought. Around 150 men were arrested in the aftermath. 2 were formally convicted of treason, and both of them were ultimately pardoned by Washington himself. The Whiskey Rebellion was over, but its political aftershocks would continue to reverberate for years afterward. Thomas Jefferson, who had warned Washington repeatedly that excise taxes would inevitably provoke exactly this kind of violent backlash, rode the resulting wave of widespread anti-tax sentiment all the way into the presidency. And one of his very first acts upon taking office in 1801 was to repeal every single internal tax on the books, including, of course, the deeply unpopular whiskey excise. Under Jefferson's leadership, the federal government would rely almost entirely on tariff revenue alone, a position it would maintain steadily until the intense financial pressures of the War of 1812 forced Congress to briefly, reluctantly reimpose certain excise taxes. Those too were quickly repealed once again after the war finally ended. And so a clear pattern emerged, one that would go on to define American fiscal policy for the next half-century or more. In peacetime, tariffs alone paid for everything the government needed. In wartime, the government would reluctantly impose temporary excise taxes and take on additional debt, only to repeal those same taxes the very moment the crisis had passed. The underlying philosophy driving all of this was crystal clear. Americans would tolerate being taxed at the border, where the levy was conveniently hidden inside the price of imported goods, but they would absolutely not tolerate being taxed at home, where the direct hand of government reached uncomfortably into their daily lives. This entire arrangement worked remarkably well, in large part because the federal government of the early 1800s was almost unrecognizably small by modern standards. It had no social security system, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no welfare programs of any kind, no agricultural subsidies, no Department of Education, no Department of Energy, no Environmental Protection Agency. The entire federal civilian workforce in the year 1800 numbered just a few thousand people total nationwide. Military spending that same year came to roughly $2.5 million, representing less than 0.5% of GDP. The entire federal budget for 1860, right on the eve of the Civil War, was approximately $78 million, and the accumulated national debt stood at $65 million. These are figures that a modern government would burn through in a matter of hours, not years. But tariffs alone weren't the complete story. The federal government had another powerful ace tucked up its sleeve, one that was genuinely unique to the American situation and that no European power could ever hope to replicate. It had land. An almost unimaginable amount of it. When the original 13 colonies won their independence, vast stretches of territory west of the Appalachian Mountains suddenly fell under direct federal control. And as the young nation continued expanding through purchases, treaties, and outright conquest, absorbing Louisiana, Florida, the Oregon Territory, and the vast Mexican Cession, the federal government found itself sitting on hundreds of millions of acres of untouched public land. This land represented a financial asset of almost incomprehensible value, and systematically selling it off became a major, reliable source of federal revenue in its own right. The Land Ordinance of 1785 established a careful, systematic method for surveying and selling off this public land. Initially, the government required buyers to purchase a substantial minimum of 640 acres at $1 per acre, but over time the terms gradually became more accessible to smaller buyers. The Harrison Land Act of 1800 halved that minimum purchase requirement down to 320 acres and allowed buyers to pay in convenient installments over time. The Land Act of 1820 reduced the minimum even further, down to just 80 acres, and dropped the price to $1.25 per acre. The revenue generated from these land sales was far from trivial. On average, it equaled about 14% of the total revenue generated from customs duties. And in certain boom years, particularly during the aggressive land rushes of the 1830s, when the forced removal of Native American tribes opened up vast new territories across the South and West for settlement, land sales spiked dramatically. In 1836 alone, over 20 million acres of public land were sold outright, generating a genuine torrent of revenue that actually pushed the entire federal government into surplus. In fact, under President Andrew Jackson in the year 1835, the United States achieved something that has never been accomplished before or since in its entire history. The national debt was paid off completely, reduced down to a grand total of just $38,000. The proceeds from land sales, which Congress had specifically pledged toward debt retirement, had achieved what once seemed like a genuine impossibility. But this land revenue system was also deeply and inextricably entangled with some of the darker chapters of American history. Much of the land being sold off had been acquired through the forced, often violent removal of Native American tribes, whose ancestral claims to the territory predated the arrival of Europeans by many thousands of years. The revenue pouring steadily into federal coffers was, in a very real and uncomfortable sense, built directly on dispossession. And the ongoing debates over how to use this vast public domain, whether to sell it for straightforward revenue, give it away to settlers through generous homesteading laws, or grant enormous tracts to railroad companies to spur rapid development, became some of the most bitterly contentious political fights of the entire 19th century. Fights that intersected directly and often tragically with the deepening question of slavery, and ultimately helped push the fracturing nation toward civil war. By the time the first shots were finally fired at Fort Sumter in April of 1861, the comfortable, familiar fiscal world of tariffs and land sales was about to be violently blown apart. The Civil War would end up costing the Union approximately $5.2 billion, an almost unthinkable, astronomical figure that dwarfed anything the federal government had ever spent before in its history. Before the war began, the government had been spending roughly $172,000 per day on average. By the time of the Battle of Bull Run just 3 months later, the War Department alone was already burning through a full $1 million a day. By the war's eventual end, the Treasury was spending a staggering $80 million every single month. Tariff revenues, which depended heavily on smooth international trade, plummeted sharply as the war disrupted shipping lanes and the Confederate blockade strangled southern ports. The government needed money and it needed it fast with no time to spare. So, for the very first time in American history, Congress did the previously unthinkable. It imposed a tax directly on the personal income of its own citizens. The Revenue Act of 1861, signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln on August 5 of that year, levied a flat 3% tax on all annual incomes above $800. At the time, only about 3% of the entire population earned that much money, so the tax was fairly narrowly targeted at the outset. But the hastily written 1861 Act lacked any real, functioning enforcement mechanism, which meant it ended up generating almost no meaningful revenue at all. The following year, Congress passed the much more comprehensive Revenue Act of 1862, which President Lincoln signed into law on July 1. This was the real game changer. The 1862 Act introduced America's very first progressive income tax, with 3% on incomes between $610,000 and 5% on everything earned above that threshold. Later on, the Revenue Act of 1864 ratcheted the top rate up further, to a full 10%. But the income tax was just one single piece of a much larger, sweeping fiscal revolution taking place. The 1862 Act also imposed excise taxes on virtually everything imaginable that moved through the economy. Liquor, tobacco, playing cards, gunpowder, feathers, telegrams, iron, leather, pianos, yachts, carriages, billiard tables, jewelry, patent medicines, newspaper advertisements, manufactured goods of every kind, processed meats, professional licenses, corporate profits, and even inheritance taxes. David Wells, who chaired the Revenue Commission back in 1865, later described the underlying philosophy behind the sprawling law with a darkly comic metaphor. He said Congress was guided by a principle similar to the advice once given to a certain Irishman visiting a country fair, which was, whenever you see a head, hit it. Congress, Wells observed dryly, followed a remarkably similar instinct. Whenever they spotted an article, a product, a trade, a profession, or any source of income whatsoever, they taxed it without hesitation. Crucially, the 1862 Act also created the brand new Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, an entirely new agency operating within the Treasury Department whose sole purpose was to collect all these newly imposed taxes. The commissioner started out with a modest staff of just 3 clerks. Within a matter of months, that had ballooned to nearly 4,000 employees, including assessors and collectors spread out across the country, many of them earning direct commissions on the taxes they successfully brought in. This was, quite literally, the birth of the agency that would eventually evolve into today's Internal Revenue Service. The income tax raised relatively modest sums at first, just $2.7 million in its first full fiscal year. But revenue climbed rapidly after that, reaching over $20 million the following year, and continuing to grow steadily as the war dragged on longer than anyone had anticipated. Still, taxes of every kind combined, the income tax, the sprawling excise taxes, and elevated tariffs, financed only about a fifth of the Union's total war costs overall. The rest came from massive borrowing, including the sale of $500 million in government war bonds, and from a genuinely revolutionary new financial instrument known as the greenback. These were paper treasury notes that circulated freely as currency, essentially allowing the government to print money outright to pay its soldiers and suppliers when actual gold and silver simply weren't available. But here's the detail that matters most for our story. The Civil War income tax was always understood, from the very beginning, to be strictly temporary. It was a wartime emergency measure, justified entirely by the extraordinary circumstances of national survival. And true to that original understanding, Congress repealed the income tax in 1872, a full 7 years after the war had ended, at a time when the federal budget was running a healthy surplus thanks to high tariffs and robust excise tax collections on liquor and tobacco. For the next 2 decades, the federal government returned comfortably to its familiar pre-war fiscal playbook. Tariffs remained the dominant source of revenue by far, though they now shared the stage with excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco. In fact, during the decades following the Civil War, roughly 90% of all federal revenue came from these same 2 sources, customs duties and so-called sin taxes. The income tax was gone, and most ordinary Americans simply assumed it was gone for good. But the political landscape was shifting steadily beneath the surface, even if most people didn't notice it happening. The late 19th century was the age of the robber barons, of Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan, of staggering industrial growth coupled with equally staggering, undeniable inequality. The tariff, which had once seemed like an elegant and painless way to fund the entire government, was increasingly coming under attack from 2 very different directions at once. Farmers and workers in the South and West argued forcefully that tariffs were deeply regressive by nature. They fell hardest on ordinary working people, who spent a much higher proportion of their limited income on imported goods than wealthy Americans did. A poor farmer buying a British-made plow paid the exact same tariff markup as a wealthy New York banker buying the same item. But for the struggling farmer, that markup represented a far larger share of his total earnings. At the same time, the tariff system had increasingly become a tool of blatant cronyism. Northern manufacturing interests lobbied relentlessly for ever higher tariffs to protect their industries from foreign competition, effectively using the government's own revenue system to enrich themselves directly at the expense of ordinary consumers. Tariff rates climbed to their highest levels in history with the McKinley Tariff of 1890, which pushed the average duty on imported goods from about 38% up to nearly 50%. Working-class Americans were paying substantially more for basic everyday necessities so that wealthy industrialists could comfortably pad their profit margins. The very system that was supposed to fund the government had quietly become a wealth transfer mechanism, systematically moving money out of the pockets of the many and into the vaults of the privileged few. And so, in the crucible of Gilded Age inequality, a genuinely new idea began to take hold across the country. What if, instead of taxing goods that everyone consumed regardless of wealth, the government simply taxed income directly, specifically targeting the income of the wealthy elite? This wasn't actually a radical concept anymore. The Civil War had already proven conclusively that an income tax was administratively feasible and could generate significant, reliable revenue when properly enforced. But turning it into permanent, lasting policy required overcoming that same stubborn constitutional hurdle the founders had erected generations earlier, the strict requirement that direct taxes be apportioned among the states according to population. In 1894, amid a severe economic depression that had forced some 600 banks to shutter their doors permanently, Congress passed the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, which included a provision imposing a 2% tax on incomes exceeding $4,000, roughly the equivalent of $90,000 in today's money. It was America's very first peacetime income tax, and it was deliberately designed to shift the tax burden squarely toward the wealthy. The political dynamics surrounding it were genuinely fascinating. Many members of Congress voted for the bill fully expecting that the Supreme Court would eventually strike it down as unconstitutional, which would conveniently allow them to tell their constituents back home that they had tried, without ever actually having to live with the real consequences of the law. And that is precisely what happened. In 1895, in the landmark case of Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the income tax was unconstitutional. The majority held that a tax on income derived from property, including rent, interest, and dividends, was essentially a direct tax that had to be apportioned among the states according to population under the Constitution. Since the Wilson-Gorman Act made no provision whatsoever for apportionment, the entire income tax provision was struck down in one stroke. The decision was politically incendiary. Justice Henry Brown, one of the 4 dissenting justices, wrote pointedly that the ruling involved nothing less than the surrender of the taxing power to the moneyed class. Farmers, workers, and populist politicians across the country were outraged by the ruling. They saw the decision as exactly what it appeared to be on its face, a legal shield erected by the wealthy to protect themselves from ever contributing their fair share to the cost of running government. The Democratic Party immediately made restoring the income tax a central plank of its national platform, openly charging the Supreme Court with judicial overreach. But constitutional amendments are notoriously difficult to pass under any circumstances. They require a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress, followed by ratification from 3/4 of all the states. For the next decade and a half, the income tax question continued to simmer steadily beneath the surface of American politics, fueled by the rising progressive movement, which argued forcefully that the entire political and economic system had been effectively captured by corporate interests and desperately needed fundamental reform. The eventual breakthrough came from a genuinely unlikely champion. President William Howard Taft, a conservative Republican who was hardly a fiery populist firebrand by any stretch of the imagination. In 1909, Taft proposed the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which would explicitly give Congress the power to levy taxes on income from whatever source derived, without any apportionment among the states, and without regard to any census or population count. It was a surgical, precisely targeted strike against the old Pollock decision, removing once and for all the constitutional obstacle that had blocked a permanent income tax for over a century. The ratification process took nearly 4 full years to complete, during which determined opponents mounted fierce, well-funded resistance. Wealthy industrialists and their political allies argued repeatedly that an income tax would make the federal government dangerously powerful and centralized, that it would punish hard-earned success and discourage entrepreneurial enterprise. Conservative senators with deep financial ties to major corporations fought the amendment tooth and nail at every single turn. But the political winds of the era were firmly against them. The progressive movement was at the very peak of its influence. The Democratic Party had won the pivotal 1912 presidential election decisively with Woodrow Wilson, and the broader public mood across the country was overwhelmingly in favor of finally taxing the rich. On February 3, 1913, the 16th Amendment was formally ratified, having been approved by the required 36 states. For the first time in its entire history, the United States now had a solid constitutional basis for a genuinely permanent, nationwide income tax. And Congress wasted absolutely no time acting on it. Later that very same year, the Revenue Act of 1913 was signed into law, imposing a 1% tax on incomes above $3,000, with a graduated surtax reaching a maximum of 7% on incomes exceeding $500,000. The rates themselves were quite modest by today's standards. In its very first year, the income tax collected just $71 million, a small fraction of what tariffs still brought in annually. Only about 3% of American households even earned enough to owe any tax at all. But the underlying structure was now firmly in place. The legal and institutional machinery that the earlier Civil War income tax had originally created decades before had never actually disappeared. The Bureau of Internal Revenue, which had quietly survived the repeal of the income tax back in 1872 by continuing to collect excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco all along, was simply repurposed and reactivated. When the income tax finally became permanent in 1913, the government didn't need to build a brand new collection agency completely from scratch. The infrastructure was already sitting there patiently waiting. And what happened next confirmed every single fear that opponents of the income tax had voiced for decades, while simultaneously vindicating every hope its supporters had quietly held onto. Within just a few short years, the income tax would transform the entire fiscal and political landscape of the United States beyond all recognition. When the First World War erupted in 1914, barely a single year after the amendment had been ratified, the government's need for revenue exploded almost overnight. The top income tax rate, which had been a modest 7% back in 1913, was raised sharply to 15% in 1916, then to a staggering 67% in 1917, and finally all the way up to 77% by 1918. The number of Americans legally required to pay income tax expanded dramatically during this period, and while rates did eventually come back down after the war ended, they never returned anywhere close to the modest, almost gentle levels of 1913. The income tax had firmly taken root in American life, and from that point forward, it would only continue to grow. By the time of the Second World War, the transformation was essentially complete. The tax base had expanded to include the vast majority of working Americans, not merely the wealthy elite it had originally targeted. In 1943, the government introduced automatic withholding, requiring employers to deduct taxes directly from workers' paychecks before employees ever even saw the actual money in hand. This was, in many ways, the single most consequential innovation in the entire history of American taxation. Withholding made the income tax almost completely invisible to ordinary people. Instead of writing one large, painful check to the government once a year, workers simply received a slightly smaller paycheck every single week without really thinking about it. The pain of taxation was quietly diffused, spread thin, hidden away inside the routine machinery of payroll processing. It was, in a strange way, brilliant. And it permanently, irreversibly altered the relationship between the ordinary citizen and the state. But let's pause here and step back for a moment to consider what was actually lost when America transitioned from a tariff-funded government to an income tax-funded one. Because the pre-1913 system wasn't simply a different administrative method for collecting the same revenue. It reflected an entirely different underlying philosophy of what government was supposed to be and do. In the old tariff era, the federal government remained small almost by necessity. Tariffs could only generate so much revenue, especially given a paradox that economists today call the Laffer curve. If you raise tariff rates too aggressively high, you inevitably discourage imports, which shrinks the underlying tax base and can actually end up reducing total revenue rather than increasing it. So there was a natural, self-imposed ceiling on exactly how much money the government could realistically raise through tariffs alone. And that ceiling kept the entire federal government genuinely lean and limited. Federal spending rarely exceeded 3% of GDP during this entire era, and the government's core responsibilities were limited to what today would be considered the bare, minimal essentials. National defense, foreign diplomacy, the postal service, customs enforcement, a basic court system, and the careful management of public lands. The income tax removed that natural ceiling entirely and permanently. Once the government could tax personal income directly, there was no longer any theoretical limit whatsoever to how much revenue it could potentially raise. And with essentially unlimited revenue came essentially unlimited ambition. Social Security was established in 1935. Medicare and Medicaid followed 3 decades later in 1965. The federal government steadily expanded into education, housing, transportation, energy policy, environmental regulation, and dozens upon dozens of other domains that would have been genuinely unimaginable to men like Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson back in their own era. Today, the federal government collects roughly $4.4 trillion per year in total revenue. Individual income taxes alone account for about $2.5 trillion of that massive sum. Payroll taxes dedicated to funding Social Security and Medicare add another $1.7 trillion on top of that. Together, these two categories of direct taxation on earned income now make up over 90% of all federal revenue combined. Tariffs, which once funded the entire government single-handedly, now bring in roughly just $80 billion annually, barely 1.5% of the total federal budget. The irony here is almost poetic when you really sit with it. The founders designed an entire system specifically intended to keep the government small and limited, and to prevent it from reaching directly into the pockets of ordinary citizens. That system lasted for well over a century, and during that time it funded a truly remarkable era of national expansion and sustained economic growth. But it was ultimately undone, in the end, by the very same forces it had originally helped create. The Industrial Revolution, which tariffs had directly helped protect and nurture through decades of deliberate policy, went on to produce staggering levels of wealth and inequality that eventually made the old tariff system politically unsustainable in the long run. The very same industrial tycoons who had benefited most from tariff protection were, ironically, the same men whose obscene personal fortunes fueled the growing public demand for a fairer income tax. The founders had built a dam, and the accumulated pressure of over a century of grievance eventually burst straight through it. What's perhaps most striking about this entire sweeping history is how clearly it illuminates a tension that still defines American politics right up to this very day. On one side, there's the deeply held belief that government should be funded through indirect means, through taxes on transactions and trade where the true cost is spread out broadly and partially hidden from view. On the other side, there's the equally strong belief that the wealthiest members of society carry a genuine moral obligation to contribute a much larger share of their income toward the common good of everyone else. This fundamental tension between hidden and visible taxation, between broad-based and progressive taxation, between a small government funded modestly by tariffs and a large government funded expansively by income taxes, this is not some new or recent debate at all. It's actually one of the oldest, most persistent debates in all of American fiscal history. It was there right at the very founding of the country. It was there boiling over violently during the Whiskey Rebellion. It was there simmering throughout the entire Gilded Age. And it's still very much here playing out in real time right now. The world that existed before 1913 was certainly not some kind of libertarian paradise, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. The old tariff system carried real costs, real injustices and real practical limitations. It funded a government that neglected vast swaths of its own population, tolerated widespread child labor, ignored genuinely unsafe working conditions in factories and mines, and provided absolutely no safety net whatsoever for the elderly, the disabled, or the truly destitute. But it was also, undeniably, a world in which the fundamental relationship between the ordinary citizen and the state was profoundly different from what we know today. You could, quite literally, go through your entire life without ever once interacting directly with a federal tax collector. The government existed, certainly, but it existed at a comfortable distance, funded primarily by the steady flow of commerce passing through its ports rather than by the direct labor of its own people. Whether that older world was genuinely better or meaningfully worse than the one we live in now depends entirely on what you personally happen to value most. But understanding that it actually existed, understanding exactly how it worked in practice, and understanding precisely why it eventually ended, that's essential knowledge for anyone who genuinely wants to make sense of the fiscal and political battles that are still raging on today, right now, in Washington and beyond. Because the question of how exactly to fund a government is never really just about money in the end. It's fundamentally about power. It's about who ultimately pays, who genuinely benefits, and who gets to decide in the first place. And those exact same questions remain just as alive and contested today as they were back when Alexander Hamilton first walked the crowded docks of New York Harbor, carefully counting the ships that would go on to fill his young nation's treasury. If this story genuinely shifted your perspective on how governments really work behind the scenes, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a like on this video before you go. We go deep on these kinds of hidden power structures all the time, the ones that quietly shape your world in ways most people never really stop to think about. And if you want to keep pulling on this particular thread, there's another video coming very soon that you will absolutely not want to miss.